To me, it's very notable that Series 4 of NuWho has gained such a high status among fans and the viewing public, to the point where the 60th anniversary specials focused almost entirely on its principal characters. And it's not too difficult to see what appeals, the interplay between the two leads notably. I just find it amusing as honestly it's not a series I can say I think there are too many classics from. I mean, yeah, Midnight is loved by many, and it's a pretty good episode in my view, but I honestly doubt I'd even say it's one of NuWho's best. The library story probably lacks the punch it did at the time. Now we know the answers to all the questions, and even more so that those answers boil down to convoluted Moffat bullshit. Turn Left is a very interesting idea and does have some really gut punch moments, but in the end it just sabotages itself by a need to be more of a setup to the finale rather than the genuine exploration of the ideas it's putting forward. And the finale, well, that's just typical NuWho spectacle bullshit, nothing else. And everything else, well, it's just not really brought into the conversation because not really much of it is all that memorable. There are 2 points to this. Firstly, that I'm a grumpy, unpleasable bastard, but you all knew that already. And secondly, and somewhat more to the point, all those episodes that are talked about in conjunction with this series, well, they're dark and depressing stories. Sure, we all love the Caves of Androzani, but we all love City of Death as well. Where's the fun in this series? This series is supposed to be about the banter and interplay between these two characters who bounce perfectly off each other. Surely that's the perfect vehicle for a bit of fun? Well, let's try this episode. Yes, The Unicorn and the Wasp, generally known as a bit of a fun diversion in all the gloom, a light-hearted romp that's both a send-up and a celebration of the detective genre, written by... Fuck. It was of enormous relief for me watching this episode, but it turned out to just be fairly okay, because I think a huge discussion about the death of the author and its applicability here would have been to nobody's benefit and just made everyone very grumpy, and that's not in the spirit of looking at a light-hearted episode, right? Right? I guess the thing that always gets me with Gareth Roberts is even before all the transphobia, his reputation in the world of Doctor Who was not exactly positive. To make a long story short, he had a reputation for just being a bit of an arsehole, and rumour has it that his dickheadedness finally came to a head on the set of The Caretaker when Peter Capaldi of all people lost patience. Probably because he was having to make The Caretaker. In any case, he never wrote for the show again, and even with RTT back, I don't think Doctor Who is that much of a mates club that he'd invite someone quite so openly vile to write for the series again, so we've probably finally seen the back of him. This is compounded by the fact that his NuWho credits are, well, never has the phrase mediocre at best ever applied quite so accurately. That rubbish Shakespeare one, those god-awful James Corden episodes, and the aforementioned The Caretaker, where we get a contest between the Doctor and Clara as to who can be more horrifically unlikable. Which, of course, despite how hard the Doctor might try with some petty racism, there can only be one winner in that contest. That both of them be our war criminal in that equation also proves the point, doesn't it? But we're not here to review that episode, thank goodness. We're here to review this one, which while certainly Robert's best for the series, also just doesn't really grasp its concept to the best it could. And most of this comes down to a script that just can't really work out what it wants to be and what kind of structure and tone it wants to commit to. Does it want to be a light-hearted comedy piece, or a dramatic murder mystery, or a send-up of the detective genre, or just a standard Doctor Who monster piece? It just seems to want to be all of them, and it struggles in a lot of places because of it. Nevertheless, I would be lying if I thought this was an unenjoyable or even a bad episode, and I will discuss why. But Roberts himself, I think that's mostly a discussion for another day. I'm just pointing out that I think he's a bad person and not a great writer, so I'm happy to place most of the flaws of this script on him. First though, something to ponder. A big issue with NuWho for me is that the entire thing seems to be based on a bit of contradiction. It always insists on taking itself deathly seriously and put itself forward as some dark, dramatic, serious drama, and it also insists on doing so many stupid bits over and over again. Now I don't mind either a dramatic or more light-hearted approach, and indeed the classic series frequently did both. I mentioned two of the greatest stories from the classic run earlier on. The Caves of Androzani is a dark, tense thriller looking at the worst impulses and actions of humanity in between showing the heroism that comes from desperation. City of Death is a fun, witty romp about an alien trying to steal the Mona Lisa that nevertheless has a clever and intriguing plot, with the humour there as a welcome background element rather than the driver of the story. Now, there are reasons this is successful and yet NuWho has problems with tone so much. Firstly, that the drama is very well executed and not just shallow melodrama, and the fun is actually witty plotting and humour rather than just putting some ridiculous spectacle in the dream or jokes about them being quirky. But secondly, and more importantly, NuWho's problem is that it never knows when to commit to a tone, which just leads to episodes and even individual scenes feeling wildly uneven. It so frequently feels like the show wants to have its cake and eat it too, and this leads to all kinds of tonal issues. This is particularly a problem in the Moffat era, as I have alluded to more than once, but the whole of NuWho is susceptible to it. But that isn't to say everything must be 100% dark or 100% funny with nothing in between. It's a case of striking the right balance and having the right kind of dark with the right kind of silly and vice versa. An example of NuWho actually doing this right, and yes, I'm about to say Stephen Moffat did something right, do not adjust your set, I'd say it's The Husbands of River Song, where a pretty silly plot, designed just to be a bit of fun, is interwoven with a very serious character plot and the end of a long-standing character's arc. Now, the reason I think this works is that there's purpose to it. The humour comes from character work, the interactions, and those characters bouncing off each other, but it also plays into the dramatic plot as well. It's very much about the Doctor and River Song, how their relationship has evolved and how it's coming to an end, and how that will affect them both. It's not just for drama for the sake of it, it's drama with a strong basis and a strong purpose. Because it feels personal, it feels natural, and thus the tone doesn't conflict. And mostly, this takes place at the end of the story once all the jokes are out of the way. The drama becomes a coda to the fun plot, and thus enough distance is given as well. NuWho does not find this balance often, it's fair to say, and interrupting cheap, ill-thought-out melodrama for a shit joke or some mindless spectacle is too often the way. Which does bring me back to this episode, which, while not exactly the worst offender in this category, does struggle a great deal with its tone, and I think the problem here is mostly that the episode just doesn't know what it wants to be, and therefore goes pretty much from scene to scene doing several completely different things, which makes it difficult in the end to grasp what they were really going for with it. There were individual parts of it that work very well, but none of those individual parts come together to form a coherent whole, and unfortunately this results in an episode with a tone that feels very uneven. A lot of that is that it's trying to pack in 45 minutes, something that probably needed an hour and maybe more, and yes, it's that age-old NuWho problem rearing its head again, and therefore feels like it doesn't explore what it's trying to explore well enough. Firstly though, we'll look at what the episode does right, and it does a great deal right. Firstly, and perhaps most importantly, the director for this episode was Graeme Harper, or as he would be called in a world where there's any justice, Sir Graeme Harper, or perhaps Lord Harper of St Albans. Harper is, I think, pretty much indisputably Doctor Who's greatest ever director. To pull off a masterpiece like The Caves of Androzani is one thing, to then come back to the show 2 decades later and direct to a consistently very high standard again is quite another. His NuWho episodes constantly demonstrate an ability to lift scripts up beyond what they are on the page, which given it's NuWho is usually not very much. In this episode he gets around the confused nature of the episode by keeping a very consistent visual and thematic style throughout, one with so much energy and drive that it keeps things exciting and engaging enough that the holes in the script are just passed over with ease. Harper adds almost a theatrical flair to much of the proceedings, and in many places leans into the tropes of the genre the script is maybe attempting to lampoon. I like these shots in particular of the Doctor and Christie looking straight on at the objects of their interrogation, for instance. He even manages to get away with a spinning newspaper bit just because of how well the sequence is played out. The flash forward bits and other flashes in both directions throughout the story add flair to otherwise very heavy exposition bits. I will have plenty of opportunities to praise Harper in the future, so I'll leave it there, but his job here does give the episode almost all of its energy and excitement. Other great things, David Tennant and Catherine Tate are in top form as always. The Doctor and Donna's relationship has always been a fantastically realised one, as I said earlier, to the point where it was brought back for the 60th anniversary, and I think the reason for that is that it's probably one of the few NuWho and companion relationships that actually call, how do I put this, remotely healthy in any way. And in my view there are two reasons for that. Firstly, I'm going to sound ridiculously old school here, like the kind of fan who would have written paragraphs about the kissing in a TV movie, but the relationship works for me because it's not a romantic one. I'm not necessarily against the idea of the Doctor having a romantic relationship with someone, but it needs specific circumstances for it to work. It just comes across as awkward and a bit uncomfortable most of the time, such as Doctor and Companion have romance that feels stilted and uncomfortable, Companion pines after Doctor in a way that sells the character or an actress short, Companion flirts with Doctor despite being married and having a husband along in the TARDIS, etc. and so forth. I don't think the idea of the Doctor having romance is necessarily a bad one, and I think it can work, and oh god, I'm about to praise Stephen Moffat again, so yes, this is me, I haven't been replaced by a Kral android or anything, but I think the Doctor's relationship with River Song actually does work on these terms. Yes, there are several terrible episodes surrounding it, and so much of it doesn't make a lick of sense at all, it's very far from perfect, but I think it works because River is more enigmatic than just a companion, the relationship they have is built around that. But I'm getting off track. The point is it doesn't really work, which is why the Doctor-Donna relationship, one where that pretense is completely stripped away and it is totally platonic, is very welcome. The second reason I think that this is the only NuWho companion relationship that works is that it's one where I feel like it's a natural and human friendship. There's no great pretensions about Donna is so important to him or the universe and is special and means everything and all that, and the way this relationship developed beyond the end of this series, through the future specials, I don't think it did too much justice in this area. But in the end, they play off each other well because their relationship is developed just to feel natural, for lack of any other description, really. The sharp wit and banter that they use to bounce off each other with works because it feels like anyone would do that with their friends. Not every Doctor-companion relationship needs to be like this, but because of the way Donna's character works, as the every woman so to speak, it means that it's the best way to approach this, and indeed it works very well. There's not really too many specific items to speak about in this episode, so there's only really one I'll focus on: when the Doctor gets poisoned and has to get a cure with Donna's help. This is a sign of how well this relationship can work, but nevertheless a sign of how NuWho's usual creative decisions can end up undermining stuff that would otherwise work really well. It feels very silly and is basically just slapstick, and it contributes to the tonal issues we'll discuss more later, and it also ends with Donna kissing the Doctor, which I don't like because of the reasons I mentioned. This isn't that kind of relationship, and it's frankly the better for the lack of that kind of thing. But what makes me give the scene my approval despite all that is that it's silly slapstick comedy, but is nevertheless based on the central tenet of their character dynamic. A friend is poisoned, the other friend needs to help them get a cure. They're desperate to help, but are naturally going to have some communications issues given the circumstances, and patience is going to run out. It's a simple premise, but one I like because it highlights the best part of this relationship. One where they have each other's backs, but will do their damnedest not to lose the argument in the process. Donna herself also gets a few nice character bits, comparing her husband from the runaway bride manipulating her with Christie's husband buggering off, and noting how it affected her and yet how she's got past it. It's a nice bit that shows off how she's grown, and that she's recognised both sides of that event. I mean, both sides of it from her point of view. I'm not suggesting that the giant spider might have had a point. Anyway, and how she's using it to help Christie learn her worth and her place in the world, just as she had learnt hers with the Doctor. So yeah, I think this stuff does work. Other stuff that works about the episode. It's a very well performed piece. All the actors are quite capable and help add to the energy and drive of the piece. Agatha Christie is played by Fenella Walgar, who I think does a very good job despite my issues with the way the character is written. She both conveys the necessary charisma for the part to work as it does, while also having a great deal of depth to her performance. It comes across very well just how much grief she is holding back at the collapse of her marriage, and how this is conflicting with her desire to do good in the moment. How someone can, at a dark place in their lives, look back and wonder how much of it has been worth it, and whether they'll be forgotten. It's a powerful thought, and one that's certainly believable in weighing her down. This part of her character arc, it works, and Walgar does play it very well. One of the best scenes of the episode is the one where she and Donna discuss this for just a few moments, but it is really good character stuff for both of them. The other parts are mostly not that notable, but still done well. A few nice comedic parts for them, very pre-Rogue One Felicity Jones as the unicorn, and the poor bloke who has to play the vicar, who after all those years of ambition to be an actor, all the years in acting school and working up through bit parts, he gets to stand at the church making buzzing noises.
Where you found them, it's...
Truly a performance worthy of Olivier himself. Mostly Odie's performances are quite good without being particularly notable. Other than what I've said, there are two major things that I think work about this episode. Firstly, it has fantastic energy and drive. Despite how the tonal stuff means the length doesn't quite work, it's nevertheless paced very well, and the plot always feels like it's progressing at just the right speed and in just the right way. Going from scene to scene, despite the tone problems, never feels jarring. It does come together in that way. A lot of it is Harper, but I'll give the script this. It keeps the audience interested, not only by presenting an interesting mystery, which we'll get to, but by keeping us invested in the characters and ideas of the plot as well. Now, not all of these work, as I'll get to, but as silly as it sounds, the fact the attempt is there does feel enough for me. And yeah, most of it is Harper, but, The second, and far more important thing in my view, is that this episode is a very effective send-up of the detective genre. Now, this is not one I'm particularly familiar with or interested in myself, but I do know two things. A, that the most famous detective fiction authors are Arthur Conan Doyle and Agatha Christie, and they already did a Sherlock Holmes send-up, plus some anti-Chinese racism back in 1977, so Christie is the central point of this makes sense. And B, there are so many famous tropes of the genre that even those who don't have much interest in it, like me, knows. Now, the script knows that most of its audience will only have working knowledge of the genre and uses this to its advantage, poking some fun at these tropes, but also using them quite effectively to create some interesting drama in its own right. In terms of poking fun, you have all the obvious stuff like gathering everyone together, accusing them of the various crimes, etc. Stuff we all know and is going to be made fun of in a few ways. The Doctor and Christie's initial examination of all the characters, for instance, the dinner on a dark and stormy night, and of course everyone going around the room detailing everyone's crimes and all that, are only really one step away from one of them doing the evil voice. One of the genuinely funny jokes of the episode is the old bloke going on about a detailed confession about a long-term lie about his disability, only for him to have done it completely pointlessly as nobody suspected him. That's both funny and also quite an amusing reversal on the usual detective story stuff. The script does handle this aspect quite well. But while it pokes fun at the detective genre stuff, it's not a parody. It does actually have quite an interesting mystery, with the obvious addition that it has a typical Doctor Who revelation at the end of the mystery and it was a giant monster the whole time. Now, some of the contents of this mystery are a bit dubious and don't work, as we'll get to, but the way it's presented and worked through is very well done. As I said earlier, it's really well paced and the information is drip-fed at exactly the right times, but also adding in new twists and revelations as it goes. For instance, the poisoning scene, as well as having character humour, also does add some extra intrigue and a new angle to the proceedings. It also uses the cast of characters effectively in the mystery, and while I did remember who it actually was this time around, if I was a first time watcher, I'm not sure I actually would have caught on. So yeah, I think it is quite effectively done. Unfortunately though, where this falls down is the actual contents of the mystery. So let's start talking about what I think doesn't work about the story, and unfortunately there is a bit to get through, which I think is good because it means I get to stop saying nice things about Gareth Roberts, who I do not want to say anything nice about. Now, the main issue with this mystery comes from the fact issues arising from the NuWho episode length problem, trademark, in that what is going on is not given remotely enough time to develop. The entire backstory of this alien is told through exposition-filled flashback, which, yeah, I get it, it's a detective fiction pastiche, that's kind of what happens, but even so, it doesn't feel like we learn enough about it to really identify with either the monster itself or with Lady What's-Her-Face getting knocked up by one. Although, as much as the episode length kind of is an issue, I have to imagine there may be ways to create more room. To be honest, I'm not sure how necessary all of the extended backstory for Lady What's-Her-Face was. Again, yeah, maybe the convoluted backstory is part of the detective genre stuff, but it does feel like we sit forever listening to her travails in India with Waspman Sr., only for Waspman Jr. to attack them and then die at the end of the episode without any further wrapping up beyond that. This is her son, even if it's a wasp, and we don't see or hear anything about a reaction to it at all. The relationship between the Wasp and the Jewel is ill-defined, and too much is reliant on the Doctor expositing what he already knows about the Wasp species. Again, yeah, I know, time is of the essence, it's NuWho, but it does all contribute to the feeling that there's nothing to this Wasp alien at all. It's just a monster there to fill out the position of the monster in the script, and that sells short the mystery surrounding it. I also have an issue with the way the character work is done in this episode. Now, I don't necessarily mind that most of the characters in this are archetypes. That fits the idea of detective stuff, and also supposed to be at its heart Agatha Christie's story, not those of the surrounding characters. The issue is with the way her character is presented, and most of it seems to be based on a few false premises. And yes, I did say I liked Walgar's portrayal, and I do, and some of the stuff surrounding what happens around this time for her, and that is good. The problem is how inconsistent this feels. From scene to scene, pretty much, Christie goes from throwing herself into detective stuff, from not wanting to at all, from being confident to being the fetus, etc. It's all over the place. She seems confused more than anything else. I also think it's based on a couple of things that don't really work. Firstly, the idea that Christie's disappearance is well known enough to be usable as a historical point in this episode I don't think works. I think she just disappeared because she was having issues with her marriage, which was breaking apart. I'm not sure a science fiction explanation was really needed, and in any case, I'd never heard of it, so I'm not sure how many people watching at the time in 2008 would, but whatever. And then also, I think the idea that because she's a great detective writer, she's a great detective, I think that's frankly pretty dubious. It's quite a bit easier to work out a mystery when you're the one writing it and you can decide who did it, and then lay all the clues to that person yourself. Now, yeah, the detective story writer would probably be better at it than the average person. I'm just not sure they'd be better at it than a detective. Bear in mind, early on in the story, the Doctor prevents the police from being called, and this is before he knows an alien is involved, so he's putting a lot of pressure on her shoulders on something there's no reason to think she'd be all that great at. Particularly as he does know that she's not exactly in the best emotional state at the moment. So yeah, given this is supposed to be her story, I don't think this is set up properly to work. But this does sort of link into the biggest problem with the episode, which is, as I've alluded to, it just doesn't know what it wants to be, and this leads to the issue that it just never sets on a tone and makes the whole thing feel so uneven. Going from the detective story tropes to being done in a light-hearted fashion, to typically RTD-era gruesome deaths, to slapstick with the Doctor being poisoned, to a tragic backstory of love lost and death, to the giant CGI wasp going around, it just doesn't know what it wants to be. If it wants to be the detective pastiche, or the dark look at the psyche of someone going through a crisis of confidence, or straight-up comedy, or just Doctor Who monster piece with a giant wasp, it just jumps between them all and therefore never feels remotely consistent. For instance, after going from all the detective stuff with the Doctor and Christie interrogating everyone, we suddenly switch to a tense scene of Donna finding and then being attacked by the wasp, which does work well thanks to Harper keeping it tense, but it just feels like it comes out of nowhere, particularly considering what had come before, and then suddenly said wasp is murdering the housekeeper, in a gruesome, horrible death that everyone seems to get over pretty quickly. See what I mean? Not only are none of these ideas allowed to sink in properly and be allowed to develop in the way they need to, but it also affects the character dynamics. The Doctor can seem frankly quite callous to be enjoying this detective stuff when several people have died horribly, and Lady What's-Her-Face seems to get over the horrible murder of her son pretty quickly as well. It also means that it just feels like a tonal mess. It definitely feels like it wanted to be too many things at once, and who knows what kind of demands existed behind the scenes. It's fairly well known that the BBC mandated a monster in every story, but the problem here is not the existence of the monster. It seems like the kind of thing that should have worked. It's not at all like the Van Gogh one where it just got in the way. Having a monster as part of your Doctor Who spin on detective stories, that works. That's putting the Doctor Who spin on that. But that's the problem. It just throws in that idea into the episode without thinking how to line it all up and make it thematically and tonally consistent. It feels just haphazard, really. Finally, there's the resolution of the episode when the mystery comes to a head, and this is, I think, the most disappointing part of the episode for me. I've already mentioned that Lady What's-Her-Face just seems too sedate, even if it's not nothing. Her son is dead and she's just a bit upset about it and not much more, but that's a very minor thing. Once we go through the accusing everyone bit, which does have some good jokes and does work as a part of the detective send-up, the problem is that it leads into a resolution that just never comes together. The drama of the Vicar's true heritage and his dual nature is painfully underdeveloped, and its true motivations and nature are left completely unexplored. I'm still somewhat at a loss as to what his true feelings were about who he really was, and how much of it was something that had developed just over the course of this episode rather than throughout his earlier life. Things such as that. The tonal issues also are clearly on display here, as we go from the jokes to the dramatic resolution very quickly, but instead of getting a proper payoff to the mystery with it being resolved in the fashion of a detective, it just turns into a typical RTD-era CGI chase ending with, oh, what do you know, a MacGuffin solving the entire plot. Just throwing the jewel into the water means the Wasp drowns itself trying to get it. Our indication that the jewel was so important to the Wasp that it would override even the most basic survival instincts and lead to the creature drowning itself was when it happened in that scene. And then Agatha Christie gets convenient amnesia from the MacGuffin rays. None of the other characters get any kind of wrap-up whatsoever. The dead people are forgotten about. The family torn apart is ignored. The jewel thief that was a major part of the mystery never even gets mentioned. And the lame tossed-off explanation is, oh, they're posh and British. They'll just be stiff upper lip about it. And that's all we get. It's such a disappointing ending, and it's not befitting the mystery that was set up for it to be concluded so poorly. It instead does focus on the popularity of Christie, which was important. It was important to her character arc, but it should only have been a small part of it rather than the only focus of the ending. Yeah, it ends disappointingly, which does cap off an episode that does feel like it should have been more. Oh, and apparently Agatha Christie will still be popular in the year 5 billion, which is a hilarious example of NuWho just not understanding timescales. Life on Earth has been around for less than 4 billion years, yet we're expected to believe in longer than that, one author will still be popular in print books. I think there are other ways to make that point without coming across quite as ridiculous as that. Anyway, back to the original point of this. Does this episode work as a bit of fun? Yeah, I'd say it does. It does have a great deal of wit to the interactions and an intriguing mystery to boot, plus an effective send-up of a popular genre, and it's very well directed and acted, so it's definitely not a 45 minutes that you'll feel cheated out of. But I just watched this and can't help wondering that frankly, in the hands of a more capable writer, this could and should have been more, a hell of a lot more than what it was. It just feels a bit half-baked and confused, and that's the big problem. Tonally, it doesn't work. And it's a shame because I think if you want to make fun Doctor Who, taking a strong central plot like this with a strong mystery and a strong send-up of another genre, I think it would be a really good way to do it, but in the end, just falls short. It's an okay episode, a good one even, but I think it could have been great. So, after some thought, I've decided to award this episode a score of 6 out of 10. I'd say it's above average for NuWho. Above all else, it is entertaining, and it has its moments of sharpness and wit. It is very well directed, well performed, and does come with a solid central mystery. It just could and should have been a lot more. And the main problem is that it just doesn't know what it wants to be, and this leads to it feeling all over the place. It gets part of the way there, but not all the way, and it just feels like a missed opportunity to be more, but then, after all, it is NuWho.